think over my years of ministry, and particularly my years of preaching, that it has become less and less for me about individual verses and more about the whole narrative arc of the Bible. I just love the story, the whole story that is the Christian tradition from the very beginning. We just finished Easter as we're recording this, and all through Holy Week, I was so moved again and again and again by the power of this story that ends with Easter. But I think from the very beginning, the story of the Creator who is so in love with creation, and whose love is so persistent and unflinching and just determined to create the best for this earth that God has created, is just so winsome, right? I think Christianity has the best story, and it persuades me to be a Christian again and again, right? Rachel Held Evans says, Christianity, has the story that I am willing to risk being wrong about. And I think that for myself too. I have always felt myself most alive when I'm leading worship. It's the time when I feel like I'm fully present and using all the parts of me, and there's great joy in that. So definitely that. I think in recent years, I've been more conscious that my particular calling in ministry is about innovation in some way, finding new language and new ways to bring the gospel alive to people. But as I look back, I think I've probably always been doing that in some ways I was not always conscious about. But I do think of that as my particular calling. But early on in my ministry, I heard someone say that that her joy, her calling, was to help people make sense of the Bible's story by using and applying the stories of their own lives to that larger story. And I thought, even at the time, and I was very young in ministry at the time, I thought, no, I think for me, it's the reverse of that. I think my calling is to help people make sense of their own lives by using the Bible's stories as metaphors or frames for helping put things into perspective and find meaning in the things that happen to us in our lives. So that's really how I have seen the preaching task and most of my work. Somebody asked me once for a 6-word mission statement for my life, and I thought then, and I still think this is true, it is reclaiming old frames for new stories, meaning taking those old stories and telling them again in a way that helps people use them to frame the experiences and the stories of their lives in a way that gives them meaning and a different perspective. I have 3 pieces of advice for people coming behind me. One is, you are freer than you know, right? You're free to change things. You're free to do ministry in the way you feel called to do it. That really, your congregation that seems stuck, and a book of discipline that seems fixed, and your fear about your next appointment are not that powerful, right? They're not nearly as powerful as the God who continues to call you. So that's what I think we have to keep remembering to pay attention to. The second thing I would say is, figure out what your superpower is and then use it, right? You don't have to be good at everything, right? whatever the gifts are that you bring to ministry, build on those and don't worry about what you can't do. I've spent years wishing that I were an extemporaneous preacher. I'm not. I'm a manuscript preacher, right? And I still wish I could just stand up and say things that were brilliant and insightful without looking at any notes, but I can't. But I can do what I do as well as I possibly can. And I have to trust that that's enough, that those things are useful to God and to the people that I love and serve. And then finally, I would say, it took me a long time to learn this, your exhaustion has no value to God. That, you know, if you're not living a life that is joyful and alive and winsome to people, then none of the words matter. It has to be the lives we are actually living that make the case for the value of a life of faith. So, you know, I grew up in a time when I thought that giving every minute of every week to God and to the church's work was what was being asked of me. I don't think that anymore. I think that we're called to live whole lives, just like the people we would tell the people that we serve, no matter what their jobs are. And I wish I'd learned that lesson earlier.
The one that is most helpful for me has been 2 Corinthians 5:17 to 6:1, where Paul says, anyone in Christ is a new creature. The old has passed away, the new has come. And then he goes on to say that in Christ, then we are his ambassadors. And God is entreating through us to the world, be reconciled to him. But also, the last part of my ministry has been on disability. I suffer from a chronic pain condition and severe pain. And so recently, the first chapter of that book, 1 Corinthians, Paul talks about comfort and being comforted by God, and we can comfort others. But also verse 10, Paul says that his time in Asia, he had a condition where he thought he was near death. And that happened to him, he says, so that he would be reminded that he lives completely dependent upon God. And that verse has been helpful to me the last few years, that I'm reminded in my condition that I'm completely dependent upon God for everything. And God is faithful, even in times of great pain. And God is here, God is faithful. And that's been very helpful for me. I've only had 3 appointments in 40 years. I think that's great. In each of them, we strive to find a place where people hurt and we could feel that hurt. In my first appointment, we started a farmer's market and farm for the new arriving people from Southeast Asia. One of my farmers donated a plot of ground, and each person got a certain amount, and they got to grow what they wanted. And they had a farmer's market where they could sell it. We also went to volunteer for the food bank there in Modesto. And the year I left, we served 365,000 meals out of the food bank, which is a lot in the 1980s. And then the same thing when I was in Newcastle. And then in San Jose, we grew the program that served, we were downtown, right in the core. We don't have too many center city churches in our conference, but San Jose First was one. And we grew that program where we served probably 7,000 to 10,000 people a week. That was really my heart. I think you have to be especially called to some sort of urban ministry. And that was my heart. We really touched so many lives and changed so many lives. hang in there. These have been tough times, I think, especially the last few years with the COVID epidemic and a lot of the changes in society. God is still faithful, you know. God is still faithful, and they should just be in ministry and focus on that, and focus on their faith and the faith of others, and you know, our job is not to be successful. Our job is to be faithful, and God is faithful, and we should be faithful too, and leave the results to God.